When my boss locked the office door, I thought I was in trouble, but I didn't expect my heart to be at risk too. The office was quiet, almost unnervingly so. My colleagues had already trickled out hours ago, leaving only the hum of the overhead lights and the faint whir of the air conditioner to break the silence. I rubbed my eyes, trying to focus on the spreadsheet that had stubbornly refused to balance, but my mind kept drifting. And then she appeared. She didn't announce herself. One moment I was alone with my thoughts, and the next, she was leaning against the edge of my desk, arms crossed, her gaze calm but piercing. There was something about the way she carried herself, an effortless confidence that somehow made the room feel smaller, more intimate. Her presence had a subtle weight, like the quiet warmth of a late afternoon sun pressing through the window. "Still here?" she asked, voice steady, tinged with amusement. I tried to hide the surprise I felt at seeing her after hours, but it failed completely. Yeah, just finishing this report," I said, forcing a casual tone that sounded anything but. She raised an eyebrow, a slow, deliberate gesture that made my stomach clench. "I've been meaning to talk to you about your attitude in meetings," she said, her voice measured but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of challenge. I swallowed, aware of a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Criticism from her wasn't just professional, it carried the weight of experience, of someone who had seen it all and could read through pretense like glass. And yet, there was something magnetic about her, something in the way her fingers traced the edge of a folder as she spoke, almost absent-mindedly, that made my chest tighten. I noticed the subtle scent of her perfume, soft, almost floral, with a hint of something warm and familiar, and it lingered around me longer than it should have. I realized I was watching the way she moved, the subtle tilt of her head, the way her hair caught the light from the desk lamp. The words she spoke about my attitude blurred into the background because my attention was entirely absorbed by her. There was a pause, just long enough for me to realize I wasn't just nervous. I was aware, painfully aware, of every little detail about her that seemed to demand my attention. A slight brush of her sleeve against my arm when she leaned over a printout, the way her eyes held mine a fraction too long, each gesture layered with unspoken tension. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, but the words felt heavy. Instead, I felt her presence, solid and undeniable, pressing into my awareness in a way I hadn't anticipated. Something inside me shifted. I knew this wasn't just a conversation about work. This was the start of something more, something that made my pulse quicken with every subtle glance and every measured step she took closer to me. The office, normally so familiar, suddenly felt like a different world. One where the rules were unspoken, and every small interaction carried the weight of possibility. And as she fixed her gaze on me, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corner of her lips, I realized that the night had only just begun. The soft click of the office door caught me off guard. My stomach twisted when I realized she had locked it behind me. It wasn't the kind of lock meant to intimidate. It was deliberate, intimate in a way that made the air between us feel charged. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my racing pulse. My mind told me to be professional, to maintain composure, but my senses betrayed me, alert to every detail of her presence. She moved closer, her footsteps measured and quiet on the carpeted floor. The dim light from the desk lamps highlighted the curves of her face and the effortless grace in her posture. Even now, in this casual office setting, she exuded authority, but there was a softness beneath it, something subtle in the way her shoulders relaxed as she leaned slightly against the desk. "Let's talk about that attitude," she said again, but this time her tone was lower, almost intimate. Not confrontational, more like an invitation. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was impossible to ignore the way her proximity made the space between us feel electric, yet oddly safe. I shifted, careful not to step back, but aware that even a small movement brought us closer. She was near enough that I could see the faintest smile tugging at her lips when she noticed my nervousness. The scent of her perfume grew stronger now, warm, inviting, almost like a memory I couldn't place. My hand itched to reach out, to touch something tangible about her, but I didn't. Not yet. Instead, we spoke. Her questions about my attitude in meetings weren't harsh. They were incisive, insightful, almost teasing. I tried to defend myself, fumbling over my words, but she listened with patience, her gaze fixed on mine. And in that silence between questions and answers, I became painfully aware of every subtle movement she made, a hand brushing the edge of a folder, the tilt of her head as she considered my explanation, the way her eyes softened when she saw me hesitate. A flicker of vulnerability passed through her, fleeting but unmistakable. For the first time, I saw beyond the professional exterior, glimpsing a human side I hadn't expected. And in that instant, I realized I was drawn to her not because of the way she commanded the room, but because of the quiet steadiness beneath it, the subtle warmth she offered without even trying. My own defensiveness began to melt away. I admitted a few truths I hadn't shared with anyone else, the words spilling out more freely than I anticipated. And she didn't judge. She didn't lecture. She simply leaned a little closer, her presence grounding me, her eyes holding mine with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. The office felt smaller, warmer, more private, even though it was the same room I had left hours earlier. Every sound, the hum of the computer, the rustle of papers, the soft cadence of her breathing, became amplified in a way that made me acutely aware of how close we had become in such a short time. Locked in here with her, I understood, this conversation wasn't just about attitude. It was about connection. And in that charged, suspended moment, I felt something shift between us, an unspoken acknowledgement that the night held possibilities neither of us could ignore. The office felt different now. The harsh edges of hierarchy and deadlines had softened, leaving a space that was just us. I could feel it in the air, in the way the light from the desk lamp pulled around her, casting her features in a soft glow. It made her seem less like a boss and more like someone I was meant to notice in ways I hadn't allowed myself to before. I hesitated, unsure if I should speak, but she gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, "It's okay. Speak." And so I did. "I guess I've been defensive lately because I feel like I'm constantly under scrutiny," I admitted, my voice lower than usual. The words felt strange on my tongue, almost embarrassing, yet there was relief in saying them aloud. She listened. Not with the sharp, evaluating eyes of a superior, but with the soft attentiveness of someone who genuinely cared. Her gaze softened, and for a moment, I caught a flicker of vulnerability in her own eyes. She leaned back slightly, letting the tension in her shoulders ease, and I realized that she, too, was human, not the untouchable authority figure I had imagined. There was something quietly comforting in seeing that, a sense of shared understanding that went beyond words. I found myself watching the way her fingers traced absent-minded patterns on the edge of her notebook. The gesture was so ordinary, yet in the quiet intimacy of the room, it became mesmerizing. I noticed the faint warmth radiating from her as she leaned closer, her presence wrapping around me in a way that felt both grounding and exhilarating. "I think sometimes we're harder on ourselves than anyone else could be," she said softly, her voice gentle, almost confessional. I nodded, surprised at the tenderness in her tone. She wasn't lecturing me. She was sharing, and in doing so, she invited me to share as well. I did. I spoke about the pressures I felt, the moments when I doubted my own abilities, the fear of not being enough. And she didn't flinch or offer empty reassurances. She simply listened, eyes steady, letting me feel heard. There was an intimacy in that act, one that went far beyond the physical space of the office. At some point, her hand brushed against mine when she handed me a pen. The contact was fleeting, but electric. I felt it in the pulse of my wrist, in the quickening of my heartbeat. And when our eyes met, something unspoken passed between us, recognition, curiosity, and the tentative spark of desire that neither of us dared name yet. We paused then, both of us aware of the quiet connection forming. The office no longer felt like a place of work. It was a sanctuary of understanding, a space where our vulnerabilities could meet without judgment. And in that shared silence, I realized that the night was changing something inside me. Something I hadn't expected. For the first time, I understood that this wasn't just about an attitude or a critique. It was about trust, and perhaps something more. And as I looked at her, the woman who had always seemed untouchable, I knew that the slow, delicate unfolding of this connection had only just begun. After the quiet confessions of earlier, the office felt almost cozy, the tension between us now shifting into something lighter, more playful. It was a subtle change, barely perceptible at first, but I felt it immediately. The way the space between us seemed to shrink, the way our words carried a teasing undertone that hadn't been there before. She leaned against the edge of the desk again, arms crossed, but this time there was a glint of amusement in her eyes. "You know," she said, tilting her head slightly, "for someone so worried about attitude, you've got a remarkable talent for looking guilty without actually admitting anything." I chuckled nervously, feeling heat rise to my cheeks. I don't think I look guilty," I stammered, though the teasing lilt in her voice made it impossible to argue convincingly. Her smile widened, subtle but undeniably captivating. She moved closer, brushing past me as she adjusted some papers on the desk. The brush of her sleeve against my arm sent a small shiver down my spine. I realized, suddenly, that every casual gesture carried a weight I hadn't anticipated: the warmth of her hand, the faint scent of her perfume, the quiet rhythm of her breathing so near my own. We began to joke, small teasing remarks exchanged like careful dances. She'd quip about my stubbornness in meetings. I'd counter with an exaggerated glare, pretending offense. Each laugh brought us closer, both physically and emotionally, the distance between boss and employee dissolving under the soft glow of the desk lamp. At one point I reached for a stack of papers on the corner of her desk, and our hands brushed briefly. The contact was electric, warm and fleeting, but it lingered in my mind far longer than it lingered on my skin. I looked up at her, meeting her eyes, and found a spark of something unspoken reflected back at me. She leaned a little closer, her shoulder almost grazing mine. "Careful," she whispered, the teasing edge in her voice tinged with something softer, more deliberate. "You're getting too comfortable." I swallowed, aware of the rapid pulse in my throat. "Maybe I like being comfortable," I admitted, a little more boldly than I intended. Her laugh was low, almost a purr, and it filled the office in a way that made the walls feel smaller, the air warmer. She moved a strand of hair behind her ear, and I noticed how the light caught the subtle highlights, framing her face in a way that made it impossible to look away. Every gesture, every glance, every shared laugh pulled me further into her orbit. The playful tension between us wasn't just flirtation, it was the delicate threading of trust and curiosity, the kind that comes before something deeper blooms. I felt my chest tighten, my senses heightened. The quiet office had transformed into a world entirely our own, where even the smallest gestures, hand brushes, shared smiles, the casual leaning closer, carried weight, anticipation, and unspoken desire. By the time she leaned back and gave me that sly, knowing look, I realized that the night had shifted again. The conversation about attitude had become a game of subtle intimacy, and I was more than willing to play along, fully aware that this slow, teasing dance was drawing us closer, moment by moment, touch by touch. The playful tension lingered, but now there was a shift, a softness settling between us. The teasing had opened a door, and through it, the realness of our emotions began to surface. I felt it first in the quiet of the office, in the way the hum of the computer and the gentle click of the desk clock seemed to amplify the space between words, allowing silences to carry weight. I began, my voice catching. "I think sometimes I get defensive because I feel like I have something to prove. Not just at work, but to myself." The confession felt fragile on my tongue, but I couldn't stop. She didn't interrupt. She simply watched, her expression open, warm, and without judgment. For the first time, I noticed the subtle vulnerability in her eyes, the slight softness at the corners, the way she exhaled slowly, as if preparing herself to share something equally raw. "I think I understand," she said quietly. Her voice was gentle, carrying the weight of her own experiences. "There are days when I feel like I have to hold everything together, like I can't let anyone see that I'm just human. It gets lonely sometimes." Her honesty caught me off guard. Up until now, she had been the figure of authority, composed and untouchable. But in that moment, her walls were down, and I realized I wasn't the only one carrying a burden of expectation. The revelation made her seem closer, more real, and I felt an unexpected warmth, an urge to reach out, to offer some measure of comfort, even though I knew we were crossing a line into something personal. I shifted in my chair slightly, hesitant yet drawn to her presence. I just want to be seen, I admitted softly, eyes meeting hers. Not just as an employee or someone younger, but for me. Her gaze softened, and she reached out, resting her hand lightly on my forearm. The touch was brief, but it sent a current through me, gentle, grounding, and intimate all at once. I felt my pulse quicken as the warmth of her hand seeped into my skin, the simple contact carrying reassurance that words alone could not. Then you are seen, she said, her thumb brushing across the back of my hand in a slow, comforting motion. The movement was so subtle, yet it spoke volumes: acceptance, understanding, and perhaps something more. My chest tightened with a mix of nervousness and anticipation, aware that the connection between us was deepening in a way neither of us had fully articulated yet. We stayed like that for a moment, silent, but together. No jokes, no teasing, no critiques, just presence. The office had become a sanctuary, a private space where vulnerability could exist without fear. And in that shared stillness, I understood that our connection was no longer just professional. It was real, delicate, and dangerously magnetic. When she finally pulled her hand back, I felt a pang of longing, but also an odd sense of security. She had acknowledged my vulnerability and, in doing so, had allowed me to see hers. That quiet, mutual understanding shifted the dynamic entirely, and I knew that what had started as a conversation about attitude was evolving into something profoundly personal and emotionally transformative. The office felt smaller now, almost intimate, as though the walls themselves had leaned in to witness the moment. The earlier vulnerability had left a trace, a lingering warmth that neither of us could ignore. I could feel it in the slight tremor of my hands, in the quiet catch of my breath every time her gaze settled on me. The teasing and laughter had faded, replaced by something heavier, more charged, something that existed in the pauses between words. She leaned a little closer, her shoulder brushing mine as she adjusted some documents on the desk. The contact was brief, casual in appearance, yet every nerve in my body seemed to ignite. I tried to focus on the papers, the spreadsheet, anything that would anchor me, but my eyes kept drifting to her, to the subtle curve of her smile, to the quiet strength and warmth in her eyes. You know, she murmured, her voice softer than before, almost intimate. I've been thinking about you differently lately. About us. The words were deliberate, careful, yet laden with meaning. My heart skipped a beat, and I realized I had been waiting for this acknowledgement without even knowing it. I swallowed, uncertain whether to speak, to break the spell she had so effortlessly woven. I think about you too, I admitted, the words tumbling out in a quiet confession. There was no bravado in my voice, only honesty, raw and unguarded. The admission hung in the air between us, delicate and electrifying. She smiled, a gentle curve of her lips that made my chest tighten. Her hand moved slightly, brushing the back of mine in the most fleeting of touches, but the warmth lingered, embedding itself into my consciousness. The subtlety of the gesture was deliberate, a silent acknowledgement of the tension that had been building for hours, the unspoken feelings we had both carefully restrained. I didn't want to say anything, not yet, she whispered, but I feel like we can't ignore it anymore. Her eyes searched mine, steady, open, inviting. In that moment, I understood, the slow, cautious dance we had been performing, the teasing, the shared glances, the small touches, had been leading to this acknowledgement of desire and connection that neither of us had dared to name fully. My hand itched to reach for hers, to close the infinitesimal gap between us, but I hesitated, savoring the tension, the thrill of the unspoken. Instead, I let my fingers hover, brushing lightly against hers, letting the contact be electric yet restrained. The quiet intimacy of the moment was enough, more than enough, to convey everything I felt: admiration, longing, respect, and a fragile hope. The office lights cast long shadows around us, and the room seemed suspended in time. Every sound, the hum of the air conditioner, the soft rustle of papers, became amplified, marking the space with a kind of sacred stillness. And as she met my gaze again, her lips curving in a faint, knowing smile, I realized that the slow, patient buildup had reached its peak. We didn't rush, didn't force anything. We simply existed in the quiet closeness of mutual recognition, hearts beating in a rhythm that was ours alone. The emotional peak had arrived, and with it, a promise that something real, delicate, and enduring was beginning, born not from haste or impulsivity, but from patience, trust, and undeniable connection. The quiet between us lingered, full of unspoken words and steady heartbeats. The office, once a place of deadlines and fluorescent harshness, had transformed into a sanctuary of shared understanding and subtle intimacy. Everything about the room, the soft glow of the desk lamps, the muted hum of the computers, even the faint scent of her perfume, felt charged with a new significance. Finally, she stepped back, giving me just a fraction more space than before. Yet even with that slight retreat, the warmth of her presence remained palpable, like sunlight lingering on skin long after the sun has set. "The door's unlocked now," she said, voice gentle, carrying that same quiet authority mixed with softness. I glanced toward the door, realizing I could leave if I wanted, but leaving felt impossible. I wasn't ready to step away from the fragile intimacy we had built over the evening. Instead, I remained where I was, hesitant, heart thrumming with the slow burn of everything that had passed between us. She noticed my pause and offered a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to leave just yet," she said, almost teasingly, though there was a depth to her tone that made my chest tighten. I moved slightly closer, careful not to overstep, drawn to her in a way that felt natural and inevitable. Her hand found mine again, gentle and grounding. She didn't squeeze, didn't pull, but the warmth of her touch spoke volumes. It was an affirmation, a bridge across the small gap between desire and restraint, connection and hesitation. I felt my pulse quicken, aware that every subtle gesture, the brush of her fingers, the tilt of her head, the faint curve of her smile, was charged with the promise of something more. For a long moment, we simply stood like that. No words were needed, the silence was enough. My eyes traced the lines of her face, the softness around her eyes, the calm confidence that had drawn me to her from the start. And I realized that what we had built in this quiet, suspended space was more than attraction. It was trust, understanding, and a deep, resonant connection that transcended age, titles, and unspoken rules. When she finally let go of my hand, it was slow, deliberate, and comforting. She gave me one last lingering look, a glance that conveyed acknowledgement, warmth, and possibility. It was not a goodbye. It was an invitation, a quiet promise that what had begun tonight would not end with the click of the door. I finally moved toward the door, but the world outside didn't feel like the same one I had entered hours ago. I carried with me the memory of her touch, her voice, the quiet intensity of the moments we had shared. And as I stepped into the night, I felt a strange, wonderful certainty that this was only the beginning, that the slow, deliberate unfolding of our connection would continue, day by day, gesture by gesture, glance by glance. The office lights dimmed behind me, and I knew that the story had reached its conclusion, not with a rush, not with fireworks, but with quiet satisfaction. The tension had resolved, the emotional arc completed, and the warmth of intimacy lingered like a soft glow in my chest. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen, understood, and quietly, wonderfully alive.